visible? Excellent. Okay, so I am not a qualitative researcher, first and foremost. I've absolutely loved this little foray of mine into it, but this is my first experience of it. I actually happened to go away and do a placement where I then did more qualitative work. So that was actually really good. But that's just a bit of a disclaimer. So we've, with Chris Chambers and Marcus Manafo and Robbie Clark and Jackie Thompson, me and my colleagues are doing a feasibility study on the sort of ability of registered reports to be registered report journals to be teamed up with funders. And I'm going to go into what both of these words mean, just in case anyone's not familiar. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over this, but if you are interested in registered reports, it's way better that you go to the Centre for Open Science's website, and I'll put the link in the chat. But a registered report essentially just, well, not just, but reframes the relationship between an author and the paper and the journal and the editor. It changes the entire relationship between all the stakeholders in the production of a paper. Because what you do is you write up your design as you kind of would anyway into a protocol, but then you submit that to the journal for full peer review and evaluation. And then based on your protocol, it's determined whether or not the journal would like to publish the eventual results of that study. Obviously, this kind of, it's not a guaranteed publication, but it's an in principle publication, because it's basically just the journal being like, look, if you say what you, if you do what you said you were going to do, then we will publish it because we think it's important, regardless of the results. So the whole point is to try and undermine publication bias and all sorts of other issues related to that. So what's happened now is that funders have joined up with registered report journals to offer some money to people in order, but they have to then go and do a registered report. Most of it's kind of like an opt-in process. So it will be that a funder is offering a grant. They'll do a standard call for funding. And then for the people who apply, they'll say, oh, we've also got this partnership with nicotine and tobacco. Would you like to submit a registered report there? And then it will go through that way. So it's very flexible and it's not meant to be mandatory in any way. So it's very small at the moment. There's only 6 funders who are currently, six funders who are teamed up with a registered report journal at the moment. And as you can kind of what Tamarin touched on with pre-registration, you can kind of see how a lot of these are very medical focused. And so you've got Flu Lab, Cancer Research, Pfizer. So they're all sort of focused on clinical research, medical research, which is essentially more confirmatory by nature. So what we wanted to do was, given that there's only 6 partnerships available, it was very, very difficult for us to have any kind of quantitative data. And we wanted to ask, okay, so what is the actual quality and efficiency of the research when it's done through this different process? But the whole beauty of qualitative is that you don't need to have like hard data, because it gives you basically a pilot and a little snapshot into what a larger version of this would be. And especially since the timescales for these things are so long, because you've got to get the funding and then you've got to do the research. So you're looking at like 2 years before you get one full observation. So that was the whole point of the qualitative study. Okay, so what I'm actually here to talk about, even though I've just talked about that study for a while and plugged registered reports, but what I'm actually here to talk about is what it's been like trying to do open science and doing this qualitative feasibility study. So this is a simplified timeline, but qualitative researchers will probably not like this, because I've made it look linear and it's much more iterative than this. But the the basic step-by-step process was that we pre-registered the study on the OSF. We then conducted 32 interviews, transcribed those 32 interviews, which was luckily not my job, but we ended up with something like 70,000 words or something like that. It was a lot of transcribing. I'm now doing a thematic analysis on all of those words. In August, again, this is where it's not linear, but we got some feedback on a very preliminary analysis of the data in August. So then are going to use that to then feed into the paper, and then we're going to write it up and publish it. So where does open science actually fit in to this not even linear timeline? So we did manage to pre-register as normal, and this is kind of like full disclosure here, but I don't see really any downsides from pre-registering exploratory research, as long as you are doing it in a way which is within your bureaucratic limits. If I can put that in as nice a term as possible. So we basically just wrote up a protocol as we would have done anyway, and just put it online. And there's no commitment to worry about deviations because it's so exploratory. We're not concerned about sticking to it at all. The whole point was to just have that framework to, because we're going to publish it online, we just had that extra pressure to be like, okay, we want to actually be proud of this and want to be happy sharing the link with people. So that's kind of why I find pre-registration useful in this context regardless. The other thing was finding open software, which I'm going to touch on. And then basically everything you see in the bottom of the slide is the data. So the idea is that we're going to share all of this data on the data.briz repository, which is basically an institutional repository in Bristol. And that's absolutely key because it allows you to make data open, but it's restricted access. So even though it is technically public, it's restricted to a certain portion of the public. So I don't think it's fully open data, but it means that at least the data is there and it will be available in perpetuity for other researchers. And the key reason as to why that's possible is because it was impossible to fully anonymize the data. And so we could only make it open by basically making it a little bit closed. But it took quite a while actually to figure out that was a solution. And I'm really glad that we did, because now we're kind of sticking to open science, but it's all about fixing it to make it work within a qualitative setting and for the study that we're doing. So the open software, this was fun. So Qualitative, because I mostly work with R or Python or Git, very beginner Python, I don't know why I said Python, but I work mostly with R. It was a bit of a shock coming into Qualitative and seeing the price of the software. Like NVivo is what I see a lot of people using. There's also Max QDA and Atlas, but these are all very expensive pieces of software, even for an individual at an academic institution. And when I then went to do my qualitative research in the civil service, that was even more of a nightmare because I couldn't afford any of this stuff because it was public money. So I just wanted to kind of find a way to do this openly, and I failed. So this is not a success story, but I just want to bring it to light because the Alternative 2 website, which I've put the picture of, it's just alternative2.net, is a great way to keep on track as to whether if any of these open source affordable versions come out relatively soon, and I hope they do, but it's just something to be aware of, that it is difficult to find open source. Sorry, this is kind of depressing, but anyway. Okay, so the downside to all of this open data, even though it's amazing that we have a resource like data.briz, and again, like this is also where if we were at a poorer institution or if I was doing it privately, I don't know how we would have shared the data because we wouldn't have had a private protected repository which would share data in a closed way. So that's a kind of side note. But even with that, I feel like we're slightly drowning in data. I'm not sure, I'm still not 100% sure what we're going to share and how we're going to share it. So we just have like sharing the interview schedules and sharing the transcripts is relatively simple because there's just one version of it. But with qualitative, because you're constantly coding and recoding, talking to people, thinking yourself, writing reflexive notes, there's such an enormous explosion of text data that I'm not really sure of which version I should share. And then if I start thinking about versions on top of that, the data then just exponentially increases, because should I share it with every iteration of my coding? Like, my answer to this is no, because it's just impossible for me to organize. But I would like to hope that if open science becomes more common within qualitative data, then we could find a way to share qualitative data as we go along, and then it's just data management, basically. There's just so much of it. So that is something to be aware of if you're going to go into this, that I just want to say, don't worry if you're trying to handle a huge amount of data. Anything you share is a bonus, like literally anything. So yeah, you just have to make it work for you. Okay, so I'm just checking the time, but I can't check it without going out of my presentation, sorry. So I just wanted to end on not a word of warning, but just that this is a balancing act. And I honestly don't think that if I hadn't been within an open science, like super supportive institution, that I would have been able to do much, if any, of this. And I don't know how much time we would have put into like thinking about, okay, how can we share this data? We really want to share it. I think we would have just been like, we can't anonymize it, let's not share it. And I wouldn't have spent as much time looking for open source software. I wouldn't, like, all this stuff. And all of that was time wasted as well. Like, well, not wasted, but all of it in a more competitive, I want to get my paper published, it has slowed down the process. So that is something to consider. I think it is slightly a competitive disadvantage if this isn't rewarded, if the open science practices of a qualitative researcher aren't rewarded. Also, just sort of colonial / lack of diversity restrictions in resources, funding, availability of the internet, all that stuff. This is where it really hits hard. Just the expenses, the lack of software, the need for a huge amount of data management, and all that stuff, but that's standard. But the pros, gonna end on a high, the pros is that I just cannot see how I could have done this in a way that wouldn't lose so much information. There's so much data that by me expecting to share it, I've saved myself so much time and saved myself from losing so much information. And also it gives me credit. It's a huge amount of work, and by sharing these huge amounts of data, it's like proving how much we've done, and it means that someone can use it in the future. And it might not be very useful now, but I have no idea who might use it in the future, and that's completely limitless. And that's kind of the excitement of open data and open materials. So that's my presentation, and I'm the perfect slide. We're really going for this. I actually first heard this analogy from Kirsty Whitaker, and she's amazing, and you should definitely follow her. But the whole point is that just do what works for you, and anything that you do